Great.
Great. Okay, welcome everybody. So this session is about qualitative methods. Full disclosure, we had originally envisioned this as 2 separate sessions and we decided to condense it to 1. So it ended up just being a lot of material to kind of put into slides in order to cover what we thought the key learning objectives would be. So I am going to keep a close eye on the time. I apologize in advance for the amount of information that I'm about to communicate. And just because of the density of the slides today, I don't think we're going to have a ton of time for like discussion unless I get through it quickly and we can do it at the end. But if you have questions, I actually think probably the best way to do it is to use the raised hand feature, because I'll keep the spotlight video up without myself, so that if you raise your hand, I should see your face kind of pop to the top of my screen and then I'll be able to call on you. So let's do that. If you have questions as I'm going along, use the raise hand and I'll pause. And please, if you do have questions, like do that, because I'd like to clarify them. The concepts today somewhat build on each other as we move through. All right. So welcome to the session on qualitative methods. The learning objectives is first to give an overview about what qualitative methods are, why we use them, what the role and purpose of this approach is. Second is to talk about different types of qualitative research, the way that we collect data in those different types and the strengths and limitations of each. And then the third is to talk about some basic principles of qualitative instrument design and how you formulate open-ended questions for different types of qualitative data collection. So this is like a humongous area that we're just going to sort of scratch the surface of today. I do want to put a few disclaimers out at the very beginning. So I would characterize myself as both a dual and mixed methods researcher. So I conduct both qualitative and quantitative research, sometimes together in a single study, which is what we would call mixed methods, but sometimes standalone qual and sometimes standalone quant. So I would say that I'm dual and mixed methods. I'm not a purely qual or purely quant person. Qualitative research is just as complicated, robust, and challenging as quantitative research, and there is absolutely no way that I can do justice to the complexity of qualitative research today. So this is like just such a quick, really like 30,000 foot overview of the field of qualitative research. We're going to have a second session on qualitative analysis. So we are going to sort of pick up some themes in a few weeks, but this is just like a really rough intro to the topic. So this is only a very brief introduction and some key issues you might want to consider as you're designing and also as you're reading qualitative studies or things that have a qualitative component. All right, so what is qualitative research? Qualitative data usually consists of words, although I don't want to overgeneralize. Sometimes it's pictures or videos, but let's just say that it's typically words, and that's what we'll be focusing on today. And there are certain research questions that are more amenable to qualitative data. So generally speaking, qualitative studies are looking to answer questions that begin with how, questions that begin with why, sometimes questions that begin with what, but generally speaking, qualitative studies are not trying to say how many or how much. So essentially, if you were to generalize from this, I would say qualitative research is trying to get at the meaning of things, not the frequency of things. So this is really about meaning and context. However, I don't want you to think that qualitative research is merely descriptive. That's not true. Qualitative research is also analytic. So meaning is not just describing a phenomenon, but as these questions indicate, how that phenomenon presents itself, why it exists. So those are analytic questions. So qualitative, I think a lot of people have this kind of like knee-jerk reaction to qualitative research that it's just descriptive. And a scholar I used to work with said, like, it's not just pinning butterflies to a board, which is, I think, what people kind of think it is. It's really about analyzing and using words to really dissect the meaning of things. I'll use this term a few times today, and I'll touch on it again in a little bit, but there's also this concept of mixed methods research, and mixed methods research incorporates both qualitative and quantitative data. And this can come in a few different flavors. So it may be one study that has both a qualitative piece and a quantitative piece, or it might be a study that integrates those or does a kind of iterative process of using qualitative and quantitative methods in a complementary way. And I'll show you a few examples of what those types of models might look like. So when is qualitative research particularly instructive? It's particularly helpful if you want to understand people's views or perspectives on an issue. It's really helpful if you want an in-depth understanding of a process or a context that exists. It's great if you want to understand how questions or why questions. Those are generally not questions that are very well suited to quantitative data. So qualitative data is really helpful here. And it's also very helpful when there's a phenomenon that either we don't understand very well or we can't measure it very well. So if we don't have really like a robust understanding or a really clear like survey tool or metric to measure something, then qualitative data can be helpful for helping us sort of figure out how we measure and how we describe something new. I will say there's what I feel is an unnecessary divide between qualitative and quantitative research. And I would encourage all of you to instead see them as complementary. So they're not rivals, they're not competing, they are different sets of methods, different sort of paradigms of research that can address different sorts of questions, and they help each other. So qual can inform the development of quant studies, can triangulate quant findings, can answer additional questions. So I would see them as tools in a toolbox, not competing, but just answering different types of questions, and they can work together when you're thinking about study designs and sort of a research agenda. Qualitative research, broadly speaking, comes in two types, and the two types are inductive and deductive. This is getting really into the weeds of the philosophy of research, but so we're just going to sort of quickly do this. Inductive reasoning is when you start with observations and you generalize upward. So you see something that happens and you use your analysis of that to then hypothesize about how what you've observed might indicate a broader phenomenon, a theory, etc. So the opposite of that is deductive. You start with a theory and then you collect data to test hypotheses that are informed by that predefined theory. And there's a really nice little diagram at the bottom here. I always get confused about which is which. And to me, the easiest way to remember it is that deductive goes down. So D for deductive and D for down. So it goes down from theory to data, whereas inductive goes up from the things you observe, the data to theory. And these are really like a cycle of things, and both quantitative and qualitative research can be deductive or inductive. You tend to see a little bit of like back and forth about is it deductive or inductive in the field of qualitative research, because if you're conducting inductive qualitative research, that's also called grounded theory. So that's like you're approaching a research question and you're approaching data collection saying essentially, I know nothing about the generalized experience here. I'm going to take what I see in front of me and build upwards from there. And that's like very common in anthropology when people are doing ethnographies. If there's something we don't understand very well, and we don't have some kind of pre-existing theory to guide our thinking, then inductive data collection is more common. I personally think like 90+% of things in public health, medicine, translational science, we have fairly good theories that we might use to help us understand the way things work, in which case deductive qualitative research is dominant. And most of what I'll talk about today is taking a more deductive approach to qualitative research. So starting with theory and going from there into developing hypotheses and then collecting data. There are many, 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 many kinds of qualitative methods, and I'm going to give you a very partial list and focus on two in particular. So probably the most common that you'll come across are in-depth interviews. These are one-on-one conversations usually between an interviewer and an interviewee. And there's a list of questions that the interviewer asks. These can be broad or narrow, open-ended or semi-structured, and we'll talk more about this in a few minutes. But these are one-on-one. I ask a question, you answer it. I ask a question, you answer it. It's a dialogue between the interviewer and the interviewee. I emphasize this because it's different than a focus group. So a focus group discussion is another common type of qualitative method, and it's a group conversation. So it's a group of, let's say, about 6 to 8 people sitting around a table, and there's a moderator, and that moderator has a list of questions, and their job is to get the participants in the group to discuss. So it's not a one-on-one between me as the moderator and each person in the group. Rather, as the moderator, I'm there to get people to talk to each other. And it's the interaction between the group members that my data are, basically. So it's not just I ask a question, one person answers, the next person answers. That's not a good focus group. A good focus group is the dialogue and interaction among the participants at the table. And we'll talk more about sort of what that looks like in a few minutes. So these are the two methods that we'll focus on today, and probably some of the most common ones that you'll come across in as a researcher and reading papers. Others that are somewhat less common, but you might still come across: consensus methods, content analysis. I won't go through this list. I do think one example that I forgot from this list is open-ended survey responses. So we're going to talk about survey data in 2 weeks. And sometimes if you've ever designed or done a survey, there's a question that's like an open-ended, like, is there anything else you want to tell us? Or what was the most useful thing about this training? And then there's just like a bunch of lines, and you're supposed to free text write in your answers, like an essay answer. So those are also qualitative data. Those are words, qualitative data, and we can think of that as another type of qualitative data collection. So if you're designing a survey that has those kinds of questions in there, that kind of, by construction, is now a mixed method survey, and you have to think about those words and how you're going to analyze them as qualitative data. I really liked this table from this book by Andrew and Halcombe that shows kind of pros and cons of different data collection methods within qualitative research. Just a few examples, not comprehensive at all. But, you know, sort of like looking at those first 2 rows, especially about interviews and focus groups. I'm not going to read through this chart. It's here for you in the slides. But just to point out that there are kind of pros and cons, and sometimes trade-offs between things like response rates and expense, right? Or things like, you know, recruiting large numbers of people might be challenging, or striking the right balance and like the diversity of a focus group to get multiple opinions. So some information here for you to come back to if you're ever debating kind of pros and cons of different approaches. But I will say on that, I mean, you can imagine that, particularly since focus group discussions are really about dialogue among people, that there might be certain research questions that are more amenable for that. And there might be certain research questions that are more amenable for a one-on-one interview. So it may be that very sensitive behaviors, risk behaviors, let's say, or health behaviors that might be stigmatized, those might be hard things to do focus groups around, just to get people to open up and dialogue about that. It might be sort of easier. You might get better data from doing a one-on-one interview. Things that affect groups of people. So like, you know, a prevention effort, like, you know, water fluorination, or, you know, something that affects groups of people, that might be an interesting thing to do a focus group around, because you want to hear how people dialogue and talk to each other about it. So there are certain questions that might lend themselves more naturally to one approach or another. I'm going to very briefly talk about sample selection, only sort of to establish kind of like some ground rules about how to think about selecting people for qualitative data. So in my opinion, the most important thing to think about when you're thinking about sampling and selecting people for, let's say, interviews, is that in all qualitative research, your sample selection is purposive. So it is not random. So in a lot of quantitative studies, like the example of the rats from last week, right? Those were randomly allocated because we wanted to control for certain characteristics and really be able to isolate the effect of, I forget what your rats were going through, but whatever it was that you were testing the rats for. Qualitative is very different. You're not trying to control for things. In fact, it's the individual characteristics of people that make them relevant to your qualitative research, that make them knowledgeable about your research question. That's why you want to talk to them, right? So don't forget, qualitative research is about the meaning of things. That's, you want to speak with people who are relevant and who have things to say. That's why they're being selected. So I think, people often kind of wrap themselves in knots thinking about, like, is this a generalizable qualitative study? By definition, it isn't. And the people who you're talking to them for a very specific reason. So I think it's important to accept that sample selection is not random for qualitative data. It is purposive, and that has pros and cons when you think about interpreting and bias and validity and so on, but it's inherent to the soul of qualitative methods that you're using purposive sample selection. There's multiple ways you can select your sample. So it might be theoretically oriented, particularly if you're doing a deductive approach. So based on a theory or a hypothesis, you might target a certain group for interviews. It might be convenience sampling. So, the first 10 people who show up when we open the outpatient department today, that's who we're going to interview. Or it might be snowball. So I interview you and I ask you to tell me the name of someone else who might be willing to be interviewed. Snowball sampling can be really helpful if there's hard to reach populations or populations that are few in number and it's hard to access them, and it's helpful to kind of get entree into those populations. Snowball sampling can be really helpful in those cases. So, no matter which of these you choose, there is always a trade-off about whether you're trying to maximize variation or seek a homogeneous sample. So for example, let's say we were doing convenience sampling, the first 10 people who walk in. Okay, but what if those first 10 people are super different in terms of their ages, and they're both men and women, and some of them are really sick and some are really healthy, and what if they're really, really different? Do we want to do that? Is that helpful for us? Or do we want a homogeneous sample? Do we want to sort of only talk to women between the ages of 40 and 44 who are relatively healthy on the day of the interview? And there's no one right answer here. And again, this gets into who's relevant, who's knowledgeable. This again is a bit of a trade-off. How many resources do you have? What's the research question? But just sort of to bear in mind that this kind of will always be an issue when you're thinking about designing qualitative studies, this trade-off between variation or homogeneity and the kind of trade-off there. An inevitable question when you're designing a qualitative study is about sample size, how many interviews do we do? And unfortunately, unlike in quantitative studies where there's helpful formulas for calculating this, there are no strict rules about sample size for qualitative data. So it's essentially a consideration based on feasibility and what's called saturation. So saturation means, let's say you've interviewed 20 people, and that 21st person you talk to, they're kind of mentioning the same things and the same themes that you've already heard. And then the 22nd person, again, same stuff you've kind of already heard. 23rd person, you've reached saturation at that point. You've essentially heard all the major themes that you're probably going to hear based on your sampling strategy. So, you're never going to reach 100% saturation. People will always see new things, but you will reach a point where there's kind of diminishing returns on each interview that you conduct. And so when you reach saturation is partly a function of how diverse your sample is, partly a function of your research question, but it's, again, this kind of trade-off between what's feasible and when do you anticipate you'll reach saturation. I do want to say that qualitative data collection is usually pretty expensive. So you're paying for an interviewer, you're probably paying for transcription of audio files, and it's also demanding on the respondent. So these interviews and focus groups generally take, let's say, an hour. Focus groups can take 90 minutes, 2 hours. So you really want to be respectful of people's time. It's not ethical to keep collecting data that you're not going to use. So as you're reaching saturation, it's the responsible, respectful, and ethical thing to do to say, okay, it's not appropriate to keep asking people to contribute data to this analysis. We've sort of reached saturation. Let's call it and move on to analysis. Speaking of analysis, We're going to talk a lot more about this in a few weeks, just to kind of briefly get the germ in your brain. So let's say you did an interview, you had an hour-long conversation with someone, you usually tape record that conversation, and then you transcribe it, so you have it all written down in a document. Then you create what's called a code book, and we'll talk a lot more about this. And that code book is used to label the text by concepts. It varies depending on whether you're doing deductive or inductive research. And so we'll talk about that, but you have this code book, you label the text, and then based on the codes, you then identify and analyze themes that emerge from the qualitative data. And we'll actually have a little bit of sort of practice with this, and I'll show you some examples when we work on, or when we talk about qualitative analysis in a few weeks. Last week, I briefly introduced the concept of validity, and so I just wanted to talk about it again here. I think there's a few particularly important potential sources of bias in qualitative research. The first is sample selection bias. So, like, not everybody has an hour to spend with you. Not everybody, let's say you did, the first 10 people in the door at the outpatient department, not everyone's a morning person. So, like, is there something about the way that you selected people that may make them unique in ways that were not part of your sampling strategy deliberately? So there definitely could be sample selection bias. There's also something called social desirability bias. This comes up in surveys also. When someone's asking us questions, particularly if there's a power dynamic, we like to say things that sound better and make us look better and are closer to the norms of society, whatever those are. So if, for example, you've ever participated in online dating, then you are well aware of social desirability bias with things like reporting people's height, right? People, men especially, tend to round up ever so slightly. Same thing as a risk in qualitative data collection. So in a one-on-one interview, if you're asking people about their behaviors, let's say, there's always a danger that people will make themselves sound just a little bit better than they actually are. Again, it's also an issue in surveys, but it's a particular danger in qualitative research because so much of the richness is the rapport between the interviewer and the interviewee. And so it's a real risk that kind of in building that like temporary friendship, that someone is sort of trying to make themselves sound a little bit better. So just, there's ways to mitigate this with good interviewers and really extensive probing and kind of ways of phrasing questions to make undesirable answers more acceptable. But even if you do all those things, it kind of is always potentially a danger lurking in the background. There's also reporting bias. Again, this is also an issue in surveys, but people will tell you what people will tell you. And so it may be, they don't want to tell you things that make them look bad. It might be they don't remember certain things as well. So they just don't go into as much detail. It doesn't come to mind for them. So you might see sort of various reporting biases. And then the last one is generalizability. So again, I don't want you to get too fixated on generalizability because it's inherently the point of qualitative research is not to be generalizable. However, you have made some decision about how to select your respondents. And so you want to at least kind of have a sense of, if you decided that, again, it was going to be women between 40 and 44 who came to the outpatient department that day and they were relatively healthy, like, okay, are the women who you spoke with a reasonable representation of that group? Like, maybe the women who show up first thing in the morning have kids because they need to get their kids to school. Does that mean something that's relevant for you when you're thinking about who your findings are generalizable to? So just kind of being cognizant, you're not trying to generalize to like everyone, but are the people you talked with like a good capture of the group that you meant to talk with? So just a quick note on mixed methods. So everything that I said about qualitative methods is true if you're doing a mixed method study. And the analogs of all of the things I just said that are true for quantitative are also true. So it's kind of like a really high bar for mixed method studies. You have to be very careful and thoughtful about all of these things because you need to attend to it on the qual side and the quant side within a single study. There's lots of cool like typologies of mixed methods research. I like this one from Steckler, who PS was my MPH thesis advisor in like the small world of things. He wrote this article in 1992, so far before I knew him, where he came up with these 4 models of mixed method studies. So the first might be you do qualitative research to help develop your quantitative measures, like a survey tool. Like, let's say you want to study something quantitatively, but you don't know how to measure it. You want to study, how safe people feel in their neighborhoods, but you don't like any of the survey tools that are out there. You might want to do some qualitative methods, some interviews, some focus groups to figure out what are the important aspects of safety in your neighborhood for people. How do they talk about these issues with each other, with you? How might you kind of represent that in a survey? So you might use qualitative methods to kind of help you develop a quantitative tool. Or you might use qualitative methods to help explain quantitative findings. So you did a study, let's say you did a program evaluation, you saw an effect or you didn't, and you want to understand why, what parts of the program worked, what parts of the program, what about the implementation of the program might help explain the effects you saw. So that's model 2. Model 3 might be, I would say it's probably the rarest, where the focus of your study is qualitative, but you use some quant methods to kind of add context and information to help people understand sort of how to interpret those qualitative findings. And then the fourth are a study where you really are kind of using qualitative and quantitative methods to answer equivalent but separate and parallel questions within the same study. And I also find that this one is fairly rare. I think models 1 and 2 are the ones that you'll probably come across the most often as you're designing studies and reading other papers. Okay, so the next several slides are about data collection. So sort of up until now, we've covered the first 2 learning objectives for today. Why do we do qual data? What are different types of qualitative data collection? The rest of today is going to talk about, okay, so you've decided you want to do a qualitative study. How do you start designing an instrument, an interview guide, a focus group guide, that sort of thing? And again, like, you could take many classes on this topic. And so we're only going to kind of scratch the surface. And these slides look short, but it's going to take a while to get through them. So buckle in. So these are some general principles of instrument design that I want to talk through. This is true for today's discussion about qualitative guides, but it's actually also true for our next discussion about survey tools. I think that's our next one. So, if you're starting to design your survey tool for your STTP project, some of these may still be relevant, even if it's a quantitative tool. So we'll talk about each of these in turn. So the first is being purposeful. So your questions, this sounds maybe obvious, but they should really relate to the study objectives. It's often tempting, if you have someone in front of you and you're already asking them a bunch of questions, to ask them some other stuff because you have their attention and you've built rapport and they're there. I would caution you against that. I think, certainly your IRB probably would caution you against that. So you want to be sure that the questions you're asking make sense. And this is important in qualitative research because a lot is about trust between the interviewer and the interviewee. And if you start going off on tangents and the person doesn't see how things are connected, you risk violating that trust. So really making sure those questions have clear kind of meaning and focus for the respondent. The second is that the questions should be concrete. They should be precise and they should be unambiguous. I mean, this is like commandment number 1 for survey research design, but it's also really important for qualitative studies. And I'll show you an example why. So asking, were you satisfied with your stay at our hotel, can mean so many different things to different people. So a better example might be, did you have a positive experience with the room service at our hotel? Why or why not? Can you tell me a little bit more about that? So it's focusing on sort of one aspect of the stay. It's not just saying, were you satisfied? It's asking whether your experience was positive. It's getting into why or why not. So it sort of is focusing the person on one aspect that you're interested in. And we'll talk about kind of different ways of doing this again in a few slides, but just being concrete, being precise in the questions that you ask. Using relevant time periods, this is like a really tricky one because again, there's no rule, there's no clear thing you can look up here. It's a judgment call, basically. But the way you can think about it is that the more major an event is, the longer time period you can kind of give someone to think about it. So major events tend to have much more salience for people. They're easier to remember, even if they were a long time ago, than more minor events, where if you have a long time period, it's really hard for people to pin down. So here are some examples. So like if you were to ask someone, what restaurants do you eat at most often? I mean, maybe now with COVID, it's a little different, but imagine like typically in your non-COVID life, I mean, that would be such a hard question. Like ever? Recently? What if someone moved? You know, it's just tough. So instead, you could say in the past 3 months, where have you gone most often? And again, this is an example of being specific about for dine-in restaurant service, because where people get takeout from might be very different. So here I'm showing sort of two concepts at once about time period and being concrete. You know, imagine that were a 1-year time frame, it would just be really hard. So for things that happen a lot, you know, think about the right time frame. 7 days might be too short, 1 year might be too long, kind of what's the right distance. But, you know, you could say, if you were interested in like a time a loved one was very ill, but you wanted to put some time bound on it, you didn't want it to be 35 years ago, you want it to have some recency, you might say in the past 5 years, has a close family member or friend experienced major illness, hospitalization, or death? Tell me about your experience with this. So again, this is an example of kind of making it more concrete and tying it to a time period. And this is an example where too short a time frame might be too limiting for a lot of people. If you had said in the past 1 month or past 6 months, you know, again, with COVID, it might be a little different, but even still, I think, you know, this is an example where a slightly longer time period will give people the space to report on this. And these are such major events that 5 years is sort of a reasonable time frame for that. If you said, what restaurants have you eaten in the last 5 years, you know, that would be impossible. So just sort of thinking about what the right pegging of time period is. In survey questions and in interview questions, important to use kind of conventional phrasing and language. So speaking in complete sentences, not using abbreviations, not using jargon, kind of knowing what the right level of language is for the right respondent. So if you're talking with both providers and patients, you might use different terminology in the two interview guides, depending on how different populations refer to things. So being really careful about the words that you're using and the phrasing that you're using. Please do not write double-barreled questions. So only ask one question per question. This is a very hard habit to break. And even I sometimes like write double-barreled questions and I don't even notice it until I show it to someone else and they're like, that's a double-barreled question. So just, you know, sort of being really conscientious about this. Here's a good example of a really bad double-barrel question. Do you think taxpayer money should be used to support sports and arts programs in schools? Those are two different questions. Do you think taxpayer money should be used to support sports programs in schools? Should taxpayer money be used to support arts programs in schools? People could have different feelings on those two things. You need to separate them out, two separate questions. So avoiding double-barreled questions. And this one's hard. So ideally, you'd like to use neutral phrasing. And if you're going to use negative or positive phrasing, being really careful and purposive when you do that. So you don't want to ask leading questions. And you want to avoid judgmental language. This can be really tricky in our field specifically, especially behaviors that may be stigmatized. Asking about these in neutral ways can be hard. And actually, sometimes you don't want to ask about them in neutral ways. You want to use phrasing that helps the respondent feel comfortable, like admitting something that might be a stigmatizing behavior. So this is one of those things where you need to really think about the subject matter and kind of the responsible way to ask about it. So something that I ask about not infrequently in my own research is about adherence to medication. And so you could ask, like, do you ever not take your HIV medication? That's very neutral. But because of social desirability bias, someone may not answer that in a very honest way. So another way to ask it could be, it can be hard to remember to take a pill every day. In the past month, about how many times have you forgotten to take your HIV medication, right? So this is kind of a leading question. This is like assuming that the person has forgotten to take their medication at least once. Normally, I would say don't ask leading questions, but this may actually just provide a little bit of an open door for someone to then say that they've ever forgotten their medications, right? So, I think generally speaking, using neutral phrasing is good, but you can imagine times when you may actually use the phrasing of questions to kind of build rapport and help someone feel comfortable saying something about their behaviors. So qualitative guides for interviews kind of come in two flavors. So there's open-ended guides and semi-structured guides. So open-ended interviews usually have only one or two very broad questions. Tell me about the last time you went to the movies. Tell me about what it's like living with type 1 diabetes. So like really broad, depending on your research question. Query. Or what are your experiences with seeing your cardiologist? Super broad. And those one or two questions are standardized. They're asked to everyone who participates in these interviews. And where the kind of nuance comes in is the interviewer then asks follow-up questions to unpack details, clarify specifics. So tell me about what it's like living with type 1 diabetes. The person starts speaking. The interviewer nods and is supportive. And when there's a pause in the conversation, the interviewer says, oh, that's really interesting. You mentioned, it can be challenging to find glucose test strips. Can you tell me, like, where do you normally buy those, right? So they kind of tweak their follow-up questions based on what the person is telling them. You can imagine it's very challenging. You need a really good interviewer to do a really good open-ended interview. But if, and this is the kind of thing you'll see in an inductive study, if you really don't know what you want to ask about, this is a great format for those sorts of interviews because you want to see where the conversation goes. You want to see the themes that someone is bringing up. So these are really open-ended questions. Oh yeah, I even have a bullet. Sorry, I forgot this was here. So this may be preferable if you're doing inductive qualitative work, if it's a topic on which very little is known, or if you don't really have a theoretical framework guiding you. I very rarely do open-ended interviews because usually the stuff that I'm doing, there is a kind of theoretical framework that I'm working with. And then in that case, we're in the world of semi-structured interview guides. So these questions have more shape and they have clear parameters for the respondent. It's still important not to be too narrow because those would be structured. So these are semi-structured. So an example would be, tell me about ways in which your doctor helps support your adherence to your HIV medications. So it's not, does your doctor do blah, blah, blah. That would be a simple yes, no question. That would be like a survey question. This is broader than that. So tell me about ways. And now I'm expecting the person gives me like a paragraph length answer of what their doctor does. If there are specific things you want to know about, like, do you get reminder text messages or something? You could ask that. And then at the end, you could say, tell me about this, or what do you like or dislike about that, or why or why not? So there's ways that you can use prompts to still get the kind of rich data. But again, don't forget, the point of qualitative is not to quantify things. You're not trying to get how often or how much. You're trying to get at these how and why questions. So that's where the real richness and meaning in qualitative data come through. I'm going to give you some design pointers for my own experience, which you can take or leave. The first is that you should really ask people about their own experiences. So in my opinion, and in my empirical experience, if you ask a doctor about their patient's experiences, they give you biased reports. You might be interested in knowing that, but you need to understand that you're now getting a filtered view because what doctors are knowledgeable about is their own experiences. So they're going to tell you about their experience talking to patients, witnessing what patients go through, right? So you're getting a kind of skewed view. So ask people about what they can tell you about. I will say an exception is for really sensitive subjects, it is sometimes in a qualitative interview helpful to ask about other people in your community or people you know. So an example is I'm developing an interview guide right now about vaccine hesitancy. And it's really direct to ask someone do you hesitate to vaccinate your own child? And so we have some lead-in questions like, do you know any parents who've hesitated to vaccinate their child? What are some of the reasons why? Or have you heard about other people who, for religious reasons, didn't want to vaccinate their child? So, sometimes with really sensitive stuff, it can be helpful to ask about other people, but generally speaking, I would say ask people about what they can tell you about. Even if your overall research question is a why question, why did people enrolled in this program, blah, 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 blah. Actually asking someone a question that begins with the word why, I would avoid it. There's lots of research that show that people get defensive if you start a question with the word why, or they might struggle to respond because they don't actually know why. So I would encourage you, if you're writing an interview guide and you see you've written down a why question, to pause and take a step back and think about what you're really wanting to know. Do you really want to know a sequence of events? If that's the case, then write your question so that it's about the sequence of events. Do you want to know about specific attributes of interest? If so, unpack that question and ask, like, it might take 2 questions or 3 questions for you to get there, but sort of unpack what you mean by why and ask the question in a different way so people don't get defensive and they're more easily able to give you the sorts of information that you're looking for. It is really important in qualitative work to think about the sequence of questions that you ask. And it's like a real rhythm of a conversation. So I'd say the 2 most important things are to build rapport at the beginning and not ending on a sour note. So building rapport at the beginning is asking warm-up questions. It's getting the person comfortable talking to you. It's introducing them to the sorts of things that you're interested in. And then not ending on a sour note. This is like a personal preference. It's been an hour. Obviously, the person would like to get back to their life. You've built rapport. So like you've kind of gotten to this like crescendo of meaning. You need to like back off from that. You can't just be like, okay, thanks for your time today, right? You have to kind of come off the mountain. So you might build in a couple questions at the end to kind of bring us back down to baseline. And I really like wrap-up questions. And I find thoughtful wrap-up questions can be incredibly revealing. So 2 examples are, is there anything else about this topic I didn't ask you about that you'd like to share with me? Like, I often get super interesting responses to that. Another is, of all the things we talked about today, which one do you think is most important? So letting someone kind of prioritize across everything you discussed what they think is most salient. So wrap-up questions, I strongly encourage building them in. I think they can be really revealing. And I do want to say, depending on your topic, there may already exist really great and potentially validated interview guides out there, and you should Google first. And in lots of journals, when people publish on qualitative studies, in the technical appendix or the supplementary files, they'll publish their interview guide. So strongly, strongly, strongly encourage you to look for existing interview guides before starting to create your own from scratch. Some considerations when designing an interview: how long and how many questions. I think for an interview, longer than an hour is really tough. And depending on the complexity of questions, about 10 to 12 questions take about an hour. So if you're planning on an hour-long interview, I would plan on an interview guide that's probably no more than about 12 questions. There may be some questions that you ask of everyone, more or less the same way. And then you can also write in probes. And probes are specific follow-ups that the interviewer can modify based on what the person tells them or what they mention or omit. So you might have a question like, what are some things your doctor does to help support your adherence to ART? Tell me about those. And then you might have probes like, if the person didn't talk about SMS reminders, make sure you ask them about that, right? So you might have these kind of specific things that you want the interviewer to specifically ask about so that you're sure it's captured. And there might potentially be skip patterns. So depending on what someone says to question A, they might get question B, or they might get skipped to question C. So one example is like, tell me about a time you spoke with a loved one about their end of life wishes. If the person has never had a conversation like that, you might want to ask, what do you think would help you have those conversations? But if someone does tell you about a conversation they've had, then you don't want to ask them this. So you'd skip this question and move on to the next one. So as you're developing an interview guide or a survey, you should think about skip patterns and when it makes sense to ask, what it makes sense to ask everyone versus what it makes sense to only ask certain people based on their previous responses. Okay, we're so close to the end, guys. Focus groups. This is just brief, and it's kind of like just to put it in contrast to interviews. Remember, these are not a set of one-on-one interviews. You're seeking dialogue between the group participants. An exception to this is I've seen really good moderators ask everyone around the table to answer the first question. It's a good way to just get everyone talking. There's lots of evidence in seminars and classes, whatever, that, you know, sort of if everyone speaks, then they're much more likely to then participate in discussion. So sort of just making that opening round around the table can be really helpful. And then the last question, that summation question, asking everyone around the table to answer that. But aside from those two potential exceptions, the rest of the focus group are not like, Rachel, what do you think? Zoe, what do you think? It's really getting people to talk to each other. A really common rhythm for a focus group is that you start really broad, and these are like icebreaker questions that set the tone for the conversation. In my experience, these are actually kind of like junk data usually, because it's so broad. It doesn't really have to do with your research question. It's just getting like everyone comfortable dialoguing and sort of setting ground rules for what you're going to talk about. And then as the group continues, the questions get more specific and more focused on the topic of interest. Once everyone's in the rhythm and the pattern of dialoguing, that's when you want to really insert the stuff that's most important to you. And then the last questions, like an interview, are summation, to bring closure to the group, to really have people reflect and sort of walk away from the group not feeling like they've been left hanging. One really fun thing about focus groups, in my opinion, is that you can build in activities. So it doesn't just have to be an interview, you know, like a guide of questions. There can be brainstorming activities, there can be sorting activities and drawing activities. People can move around the room. You could do prioritization activities. So focus groups can kind of take a bunch of different forms and include a bunch of different activities during, let's say, the 90 minutes or 2 hours that you're together. And all of these would be considered qualitative data that were collected during the group. So some sort of broad tips for collecting qualitative data. You need a good interviewer or a good focus group moderator. And actually, these are often different people. So I do a fair amount of qualitative interviewing. I am a not very good focus group moderator. So I know this about myself. I am much better one-on-one. I just don't do well as a focus group moderator. So these are sort of different skills. And if you're going to do focus groups, especially, I would encourage you to look for someone experienced with moderating focus groups, because it is a very separate skill set and kind of like just like a different proficiency. So what makes a good interviewer or moderator? You ideally want someone who has good knowledge of the topic, because don't forget, they're going to be probing, they're going to be asking follow-up questions. So they need to know enough to be able to do that in like an intelligent way and not ask questions that sort of seem obvious. If they ask questions that seem obvious or sort of off key, then they risk breaking that rapport that they've built with their interviewee. You often want to think about interviewers who are similar to respondents in maybe age, gender, roles. There's like a few parameters you might think about trying to match your interviewers to respondents. Sometimes this isn't possible, but it's worth thinking about, right? You don't want your interviewer to be really intimidating so the person doesn't open up. You don't want them to seem really young so the respondent, you know, if you're talking to elderly folks, they don't respect them. So I think it's like calibrating the interviewer-interviewee relationship. Sometimes, however, it's helpful to have a mismatch. So just being thoughtful about sort of who's interviewing whom. Your interviewer needs to have a really good grasp of the guide and what the purpose of the research is, so that they can skip around and probe well. It's not as simple as just sort of going down the list. It's not a survey. They need to be able to adapt and go with the flow of the conversation and still collect good data. They also need to be skilled in collecting qualitative data. So it's pretty tough to do qualitative interviews. You need to ask the questions, but also do a variety of things to make the respondent feel at ease and keep talking to you. So there's verbal and non-verbal cues and encouragements. There's comfort with pauses and not rushing into the next question, but also knowing when to move on. There's also skillful ways of doing probing. So this really is like an area of expertise and skill that people spend years developing. And so I would encourage you to sort of look for people who are really skilled at collecting good qualitative data. And then focus group moderators, like I said, they need like a whole additional set of skills in how to guide, manage, and encourage group dynamics. Again, I am terrible at this, so I can't really give you insights as to like who those people are, but they exist. And if you ever see a good focus group moderator, it's like, you know, sort of watching someone conduct an orchestra. It's really amazing. Generally, ideally, we like to audio record qualitative interviews and focus groups. You need to get the respondent to consent to this, and it needs to be part of your consent form, but it helps you as the interviewer pay more attention to what they're saying rather than furiously taking notes. You still do want to take some notes. It's helpful to write things down. You know, tape recorders can fail, or you might want handwritten notes to refer to later as you're kind of going through the guide and remembering what to follow up on. And it's really nice to have a dedicated note taker. It is a must to have a dedicated note taker for a focus group. So to staff a focus group, you need a moderator and a note taker at minimum. So just sort of bear that in mind. It's nice to have one for interviews, but it's not strictly necessary. Here is a whole slew of resources. There are so many good books about qualitative research. All the ones that I've listed here, you can access like online through the UCLA library. You don't need to go get the physical copy. They're all like virtually available right now. And there's like dozens and dozens more. These are just some that I've used and I like. There's also really good video resources. So Yale has a whole series called Fundamentals of Qualitative Research Methods. There's 6 modules, and the first one is this link here, and then you'll see the other 5. And then Richard Kruger is like a renowned focus group expert. He has a really great website with all of his books listed and whatever, but he also has videos of a training course that he's done, that he's led. And they're like hour-long videos, basically about all the things that were on one slide just now, but there's like an hour-long video on each one of those. So if you are interested in doing focus groups, I think his website and those videos are really great. Woo, okay. Wow, that was like truly a whirlwind through qualitative methods. So I know we're almost out of time. If anyone has questions, I see there's one in the chat, so I'm going to look. In international research, are there pros and cons to doing your own interviews? Yes, absolutely. There are major pros and cons. So we'll talk about this. I should have had a slide in here today, but after you analyze your data and you go to report your qualitative data, there are now these checklists. So if you've ever done like EPI studies, there's checklists in EPI. So now there's checklists for qualitative research to really help people assess like the rigor and quality of the research that you did. And some of those checklists include things about the interviewer-interviewee dynamics. What kind of training did the interviewer have? How did they address the power differential between themselves and respondents? So, you know, I think, Tracy, you highlight one thing, which is the language issue, right? So I do a fair amount of qualitative work in Malawi. I do not speak Chichewa or any other dialect in Malawi. So I do not, just as a function of that, I don't conduct my own interviews. But even if I did, so when we interview healthcare workers, for example, I generally don't do those either. Like, yes, we could do those interviews in English and I could do them, but there is an inherent power differential between myself and the interviewee that I think could affect the results of that interview. So sometimes you don't have the resources to have another interviewer. Sometimes you are the best interviewer. So like I have done interviews for some international projects where actually my role, my expertise, and who I was an asset to those interviews. So I think it's sort of knowing when you're the right interviewer and when you're not. And if you have the ability to bring an interviewer on board who's sort of a better fit, knowing when that is, and ideally having the resources to do that. Thanks for that question, though. Great question. I'm so sorry for just like that wall of words that I just laid on you guys.
It was really exciting, actually. It just makes me want to get out there and do more of it, actually.
I love doing qual work. I think it's so fun and just like fascinating. And yeah, anyway, okay. Any other questions? I know several of you are doing qualitative work. So if as you're like developing your guides and studies, I'm happy to talk to you and, you know, sort of talk about I didn't really even talk about like the process of developing a guide. So I'm happy to talk about that too. So just email me and we can set up a meeting. Christine.
I had a quick question when it came to like thematic analysis. I think one thing that I always wondered about for qualitative research is that when someone does thematic analysis, like it's so easy to like to find like a why or a reason in like a few quotes, and then like that's all that you look for in like so many of the other quotes or like the other survey data and stuff. I was wondering if there's like a way to like counteract that bias, I guess, so that you don't like find a why that supports your own previously held like hypothesis or belief.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we'll talk about that in qualitative analysis in a few weeks. I think part of it is engaging multiple people in the process of coding and analyzing. And I think one thing I really probably underemphasized today that I will plug now is that you should really have a team of people working on designing these studies and designing these guides. So like, I never work on qual studies by myself. And it's partly for exactly this reason that like, I'm usually coming at it for a particular reason or motivation. And I want to make sure that like my questions don't reflect that, my sample selection doesn't reflect that. And then later that my analysis doesn't reflect that. So, in quant data also, it's easy to cherry pick findings and those sorts of things. But I think engaging a team of diverse people, so your expertise, other expertise is one of the best ways to kind of combat against that. And then we'll talk about more in analysis, kind of what that looks like and what the steps are like for doing that. But great question.
Thank you so much. That really helps.
Great.
And I know we're at the end of the hour here, and this is so action-packed, but one thing I didn't know about when I first learned qualitative research was the whole translation and back translation. So maybe that's something we can talk about more in detail, because I think some people will be doing interviews in other languages. And I think people are paying more attention to that now than they used to.
Yeah, and so we could talk about this during survey tool development too, but I think, so I obviously draft my interview guides and my survey tools in English because that's my primary language. And then if I'm doing data collection in another country where the data won't be collected in English, then we have to translate those guides into whatever language it is. So let's say into Chichewa and Malawi. Often the concepts we're asking about are like a little complicated and maybe the translation isn't quite right. And so we'll translate the tools and then we'll ask a new independent person to back translate them back to English. So I can make sure that the way that those concepts have been captured in the questions are the way that I meant them. And that's often a way where you could say like, oh no, especially like you can imagine with things like mental health or, sexual behaviors. We had this a lot when we were asking about like alcohol and tobacco use, like the way that things are communicated in a language other than English, and English might be different. So this process of translation and back translation and really sort of checking. And then during analysis, I'm working off English language transcripts, but if anything is like weird, I'll ask my Chichewa speaking colleagues to go back to the recordings and say like, was this captured right in the translation of this paragraph? Can you sort of spot check this for me? And we'll go back and forth on that as well. Great. Well, I know you guys have a class anatomy or something to rush to. Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you. Fantastic.
Oh, good.
We'll see everyone in 2 weeks.
See you in 2
Again,
weeks.
Corrina.
Thanks.
Bye.
Have a good day, everyone.
Bye, everyone.